Mother Teresa visited Australia repeatedly and left her footprint on this land through the 14 mission houses of her sisters here, including their Pacific Mother House in Surrey Hills, here in Sydney. But the first mission house she founded in our region was in Bourke, New South Wales, with a specific mission to help the Aborigines and the outback's poorest, sickest and most dispossessed. One story of her time in Bourke that I particularly like is when she visited an old man whom no one seemed to know existed. The room in which she lived was in a terrible state of neglect. The floors were filthy and the furniture dilapidated. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and the curtains were drawn tight shut so that no light penetrated the room. The man was living in a state of near total darkness, symptomatic of his internal gloom, his hopelessness and despair. Mother Teresa confessed to her sisters that she really didn't know what to do for him. He obviously had no friend in the world. So despite his initial protests, she started to clean up his room. Under all the mess, she discovered a beautiful oil lamp, covered with layers of dust and grime. She dusted and polished it until it shone. "How come you never light this lamp?" she asked. "Why should I light it?" he replied. "I don't need it for myself. I'm used to living in the dark, and no one ever comes to see me." "Will you promise me to light it if someone comes to see you?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "If I hear a human voice, I'll light the lamp." From that day forward, one of Mother Teresa's nuns began to visit the man. It was the beginning of a new life for him, a life brightened up not only by lamplight, but especially by the hope and love which had been lit in his heart. All because someone had taken an interest in him. Time passed and gradually he recovered. One day he was able to tell the sister she needn't come anymore. "From now on, I'll be able to manage on my own," he said. "But do me a favour. Tell the wrinkle-faced nun who came to see me the first time that the light she lit in my life is still burning." Today, Pope Francis will recognise that that wrinkle-faced sister is a saint of God, and that the light she lit is still burning in the Catholic Church. Adding the name saint to her titles from tonight will no doubt bring a wry smile to the face of the humble Teresa, as did the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. The state funeral granted her like Gandhi by the Indian nation, and most gloriously of all, being made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1982. Perhaps, though, no title captures her so well as the name Mother, a word that speaks of fruitfulness and intimacy and nurture, both of a spiritual family that grew from a small handful of women in 1949 to somewhere around 5,000 missionaries of charity today, and as the mother of the poorest of the poor in India and beyond throughout her extraordinary life. It all began when Agnes Gonjay Boyajo was born in 1910 to a Kosovar Albanian family in Skopje, in what was then the Ottoman Empire and is now Macedonia. Fascinated from a young age by stories of missionaries, she discerned at an early age that she was called to religious life in a missionary order. She joined the Loreto Sisters at 18, learned English in Ireland, and was sent to the novitiate in Darjeeling in 1929, where she took the religious name Teresa in honour of Saint Therese of Lisieux, then newly canonised and named patron saint of missionaries. Serving as a teacher and headmistress in Calcutta, she was increasingly disturbed by the poverty and violence she saw there. One day, while on the train back to her convent, Teresa heard Jesus calling her to live amongst the destitute and to help them as one of the poor herself. And so, in 1948, she gained permission to do so, and her new congregation evolved from there, speaking by deeds more than words of Christ's thirst for souls and love for the most dispossessed. Teresa's life might be said to illustrate the wisdom of our first reading tonight, about the difficulty of knowing God's mind and discerning His will. If even Teresa changed vocational course and experienced abandonment, it's hardly surprising that many of us, less mature in the spiritual life, find much of what God permits opaque. Our epistle tonight too, in which St. Paul frees the slave Onesimus, is paralleled in Teresa's life of returning dignity to those of lowest caste, the poor, lepers, those with AIDS, the dying, and those enslaved by sin, addiction, or anything else that degrades the human spirit. Teresa could honestly say, as she did, "I see God in every human being. When I wash the leper's wounds, I am nursing the Lord Himself." So too, her life might be said to illustrate our hard gospel passage, with its talk of preferring Christ to family, friends, even our own life. To understand such talk from Jesus, we must understand His insistence that we love God first and demonstrate that love by acts of charity towards our neighbours. If we do not love God first, then our acts of charity will lose inspiration and direction, become heartless, bureaucratic, even self-serving, and ultimately dry up. There is always the danger, Teresa observed, that we just do the work for the sake of the work. This is where the respect and the love and the devotion must come in. That we do it for God, to Christ. And that's why we try to do it as beautifully as possible. To say we love God while ignoring our needy neighbour is a fraud. And we risk spiritualising away the sufferings of others and excusing our own sloth or selfishness. And so Teresa could tell her sisters to spread love everywhere you go, so that no one ever comes to you without leaving happier. Teresa's life might be said to be a parable, a story that shows what it means to love with that cross-shaped love that points upwards to God and outwards to our neighbours. The first vertical pole of love holding up the second. For Mother, that cross-shaped love was to be expressed for the poor and from amongst the poor, and so she lived the dispossession of our gospel passage. Yet some of her more cynical critics have complained that poverty was not too hard for her. After all, she'd grown up with very little, and that she could rub shoulders with the mighty when she wanted. We might be tempted to respond defensively to such pusillanimous ingrates on behalf of Mother Teresa, but she would have none of that. Instead, we might reflect on how very real and very deep was her personal experience of the poverty of the poor. On how behind that joyful smile there was a deep pain, and that this was her true dispossession, her truest personal poverty. In recent years, we've learnt that this saintly woman endured a long, dark night of the soul, in which she felt separated from God, even rejected by him at times, even as she experienced an ever-growing longing for his love. She knew firsthand what it meant for a disciple to take up the cross and follow, to follow Christ. I have experienced the paradox, she said, that if you love until it hurts, there will be no more hurt, only more love. She persisted in faithful love, and so today we recognise in her not just the extraordinary joy that radiated from her wrinkled face, not just the good works she did and established for others to do. We recognise in her a mother and a saint. As she said in her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, so we might hear her tonight speak from the heavenly altar. Holiness is not just a luxury for a few. It is the simple duty for you and for me. Saint Teresa of Calcutta, pray for us.